So during the State of the Nation address, President Cyril Ramaphosa said the rising cost of living is deepening poverty and inequality. Government has also decided to continue the social relief of distress grant, which currently reaches around 7.8 million people. For more on this, we speak to political economist Lebohang Pheko. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time this afternoon. Perhaps let's focus on what the Secretary General of the party said the day after the delivery of the State of the Nation address, especially where state-owned entities are concerned. Fikile Mbalula said that the party is considering using the model of China where SOEs are concerned. Now, when you take a look at the development strategy of Beijing in relation to that of the Republic of South Africa, is there an understanding from those who use China as an example of how they have gotten things right?
That's a really interesting question. So I think South Africa, there are different potential models for any budget allocation. So some countries use incremental budgeting, which is the assumption that we're going to use the previous year's figures and then perhaps use a model, different projection models which take into account interest rates, inflation, and the performance of each department accordingly. There are others that use activity-based budgeting, which assumes that we're going to look at the ways in which particular government departments have allocated tasks and objectives from year to year, and then allocate funds according to that, and that this also links to then reprioritizing or reallocating depending on the shifts in priority. So unlike the 3 to 5 year sort of approach that we would use, and that's quite an agile approach. And the others that use the value proposition budgeting, we use zero budgeting, as you know, and that really means that the assumption is that every single year we are starting from scratch. The assumption is also that it means that if there's a need for particular urgent cost contingencies, we have the flexibility to be able to apply those particular kinds of contingencies. It also means that there's a high level of involvement across different government departments and between ourselves. So that means at the national level, at provincial level, and ideally at local government level. It obviously isn't as smooth as that in theory. Now, where we come into play in terms of the China model is that this assumes that certain things are working appropriately. So, for example, state-owned enterprises in China are extremely statist. The state is the primary shareholder, the majority shareholder. They are highly subsidized. But the other thing that they have is they also have a huge internal model, an internal market. So 1.5 billion people who are able to service the debt, who are also able to support, to provide an ongoing market for all of the utilities there. We in South Africa have pursued a different model. So if we look at the history of state-owned enterprises in South Africa, these were actually labor absorption mechanisms for the apartheid Afrikaner bond. And a lot of our state-owned enterprises are almost 100 years old. Some of them have fallen away over the years. But unfortunately, we haven't necessarily been able to update the raison d'etre for a lot of our state-owned enterprises. The other thing, of course, has been that there hasn't been the due diligence that is required in some instances, not in all. There's some state-owned enterprises that run extremely well, but unfortunately, there are a few that have been highly visibilized that don't run as well. And that, could be because of the political deployment, because of lack of due diligence, because of over-invoicing, because of tender protocols that have been followed very well, because of poor governance and so forth. So I think that when we're looking at budget allocations, remember that there has been a very low appetite for any more bailouts for state-owned enterprises and so forth.
China also achieved tremendous results because of their industrialization policy. And so when we take a look at that in relation to the Republic of South Africa, what would your assessment be, given that at the State of the Nation address, the President said we need to have an industrial policy that will respond, for instance, to our trade and economic position in Africa. And so even though we have ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area Act, there's still no free movement of persons, which is a big factor in terms of the success of this dream.
And I think the other piece of that is not only the free movement of people, the movement of enterprises. So the movement of people means that, and the viewers, that we're also going to be able to enable and facilitate and fast track the free movement of small scale entrepreneurs. So what people often describe as, it's a whole spectrum. So we usually talk about, your cross-border traders, who I prefer to refer to as cross-border entrepreneurs, to the businesses which might have enterprises in a particular country, but are not able to translate those enterprises across SADC, for example. Let's just begin there, or between different free trade areas. There's also already an issue with rationalizing our free trade areas. So, for example, something as simple as understanding that we need to do the very painful work of rationalizing the goods and services, the tax and excises across and between countries. Something very simple. If I export a kilo of coffee between here and Namibia, or between here and Botswana, how much will it weigh by the time it reaches its destination? And these are the things that people don't really, this is the hard work that people don't often do. So the value of that coffee by the time it lands in Botswana or in Namibia will be different. Now, if we complicate that further and take this to, for example, exporting that same kilo of coffee to Kenya, to Nigeria, to Ghana, bear in mind that there are taxes and duties that must be paid on the way, right, upon leaving and upon arrival, but that we have different tax and duty regimes between free trade areas. So the fact that the ACFTA has been signed by some countries, most countries, and not necessarily all at the moment, but has not yet been actualized and has not yet become a living, breathing document, complicates our capacity to move our goods and services and people who are the bastion of those goods and services and those skills and those resources between borders as well.
Absolutely. And since we're going to use China as an example, right, so during the debate now for SONA that is currently sitting there back at 2:15, one of the opposition parties said where corruption is concerned, the African National Congress is accused number one, and that's Udarubantu Holomisa. And so when you take a look at China, how they have at least managed to manage perceptions about what they are getting right when it comes to people who are found with their hands in the cookie jar or hands where they're not supposed to be, they get chopped off. Is this something that we're seeing in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, Dudu, I don't know if we are up for amputations and so forth, but I do think that the notion of consequent management is quite important. The notion of Khuswaba, Amahloni, I think is probably something that we're lacking at the moment. But more than that, we hear that, of course, we need to be able to have a state service, a public sector that is completely above reproach. We also need to be able to ensure that when things are found to be lacking, for example, misappropriation of funds, mismanagement of funds, that we do the due diligence and the appropriate investigations to ensure that the costs are recovered, for one thing, that there is some kind of a recovery cost and also some kind of a compensation that is in the public domain. There are three different kinds of loss or leakage that we're familiar with in this country, which is misappropriated funds, which is missing funds, or which is just misspent funds. I find the idea of distinguishing between misappropriated and misallocated quite strange, or just misspent. But the point is that this means that there is money, significant amounts of money, including even by the finance department itself, that is leaking, and there are no consequences that are paid for this. And I think that it would be useful to put the PFMA, which is already quite rigorous, by the way, to put the PFMA into much more rigorous use. And, yes, we've had the Zondo Commission, but we need to institutionalize those sorts of sanctions and to institutionalize the idea that working for the state is a public honor, not just an opportunity perhaps to sip some gravy.
I think I should have issued a warning, Lebohang, that that example was metaphorical. But when we take a look at what we heard from the Trade and Industry Minister, Ibrahim Patel, I mean, he painted somewhat of a good picture, really, of what is happening. Speaking of record levels of exports to other countries on the continent, jobs that have been created, some manufacturing plants, including in Gqeberha. But he also said this, black excellence is driving industrialization in our economy. According to the work that you do, are you able to maybe not vouch for this, but agree? Is this something you are seeing in the work that you do?
Yeah, so I mean, we are an export-driven economy, Dudu. So I mean, our mineral products are about 24% on entire exports. Our base metals are about 9.3%. Our aircraft vessels, by the way, are about 9.2%. Machinery, chemicals, and our primary export partners are yet again China, Germany, the United States, and Germany. And I think that the thing is that we have always been talking about the need to diversify away from this export-driven, commodities-driven economy. Why? Because commodities are extremely irrational. They're not fixed. They behave and they respond to different stimuli, such as fuel prices, such as war. And because of this, the prices are also elasticated and they're not static. The other thing, of course, is that if we remember that commodities are typically the prices of commodities, even the pricing of commodities has its own imperial colonial imprint. So the prices of coffee are set by a particular place in New York, and then we know that of course that gold, platinum, and so forth. A lot of these are set primarily across London and across other European capitals. So until and unless we're able to challenge and rebut that model, we will be export driven, but we will continue to be a successful commodities driven economy. But this is not necessarily sustainable for future. But I wouldn't per se disagree at all with Minister Patel. What I would, however, ask is, what is the beneficiation? We are going to continue to export raw commodities, right? Raw gold, raw platinum, rather than appreciating it on the value chain. And of course, there's a whole reason for that. For example, the difficulties in penetrating the very high cost and the high import costs of finished products. But surely we have a bit more negotiating power than that. And of course, that unfortunately, when we look at the volumes of minerals that we are exporting across the world, they are not in any way, Dudu and the viewers, having any tangible impact on our employment sector, on our on a reskilled and upskilled workforce. And most unfortunately, there is no distributional value in shifting the poverty needle in this country.
Lebohang Pheko is a political economist. Always a pleasure. Thank you, ma'am.